California, July 1945. The first light of dawn spreads across the San Joaquin Valley, painting the endless rows of citrus trees in molten gold. Dew clings to every leaf, and the air carries the mingled scent of earth, diesel, and something faintly sweet. A Japanese prisoner in khaki work clothes pauses in the furrowed soil, his breath catching, as he lifts an orange from the ground. It rolls in his rough hands, smooth, cool, perfectly round, unlike anything he has touched in months of confinement. Corporal Masao Kondo had known ration tins and muddy rice, had seen fire sweep through the jungles of the Marianas and leave men hollow-eyed and trembling. But here, inside a fenced California orchard, he stands before an ocean of color, thousands of trees heavy with fruit that no one seems desperate to hoard. Around him, the other prisoners work in silence under the watch of U.S. guards perched in jeeps. Some of the men murmur in disbelief. The scent is too rich, the abundance too effortless. The guards, mostly farmhands in uniform, shout the day's instructions. The prisoners bend to their labor, clipping, gathering, stacking. The rhythm becomes mechanical, a kind of peaceful captivity. Above, a train whistle echoes from the valley, bound for the coast. Each car carries crates of citrus marked California Sunshine, destined for markets thousands of miles away. Kondo looks toward the fence, where the wire glints like silver in the morning sun. Beyond it, a young American boy on a bicycle watches the workers with open curiosity. The boy's lunch pail sits beside him, an apple, a sandwich, and tucked in wax paper, half an orange. The prisoner cannot help but stare. For him, that single orange half is more than food. It is a symbol of distance between war and peace, defeat and survival. He glances down again at the fruit in his hand, its scent flooding him with memories of another shore, another sun. He wonders if, someday, he will be permitted to taste it. Before we move deeper into this forgotten story, subscribe to POW Tales, where real history speaks. The journey begins beyond those barbed wires, in the heart of California's quiet abundance. The context unfolds there. By the summer of 1945, the quiet rhythms of California's farmlands were being carried out by unexpected hands. Across the United States, over 400,000 prisoners of war lived behind barbed wire. Men from every corner of the Axis powers, scattered through 46 states. They harvested cotton in Texas, cut timber in Oregon, and tended orchards in the valleys of the West. But among them, only a small fraction were Japanese, just over 6,000, held in guarded isolation camps from Idaho to the deserts of Arizona. These men were considered the most ideologically hardened, the least likely to cooperate. The War Department's psychological reports labeled them fanatically devoted, resistant to re-education, and a security risk in contact with civilians. Yet America's agricultural crisis, worsened by the draft, rationing, and labor shortages, left farmers desperate. The War Manpower Commission and the U.S. Army negotiated a compromise. Under strict guard, Japanese POWs could be loaned out to private farms to pick fruit, clear irrigation ditches, or repair fences. Thus, the strange arrangement began. Every morning, trucks marked U.S. Army rattled through small towns carrying prisoners who would spend the day under the California sun. For the farmers, it was labor. For the army, a test of control. But for the prisoners, men like Corporal Masao Kondo, it was a bewildering collision of worlds. When Kondo's group first arrived at Camp McCoy's California branch, they found it nothing like the brutal stockades of wartime imagination. The camp was an ordered landscape of wooden barracks and open sky, surrounded by a double perimeter of wire. The guards were local reservists, some barely out of high school. They enforced rules, yes, but their manner was less cruel than indifferent. It was the land itself that seemed to challenge the prisoners' ideas of their enemy, vast, green, impossibly productive. On their first day in the fields, Kondo was struck by the sheer precision of it all. The irrigation canals carved perfect geometric lines across the soil. The packing sheds ran with mechanical rhythm, their conveyors humming like factories. He had seen American efficiency in war, in the relentless bombardments that had turned jungles to ash. But here, that same discipline produced not destruction, but nourishment. A diary later recovered by U.S. censors from one of the prisoners' trunks captured this sentiment in careful script. They fight with machines, yes, but they also feed with machines. It is a strange power. The prisoners worked long hours, often from dawn until late afternoon, rewarded only with extra rations and the brief satisfaction of physical exhaustion. But compared to the jungle starvation of Saipan, this was luxury. They were issued clean clothes, allowed to bathe weekly, and given modest medical care. A few were even permitted to write home under the eye of translators, though few letters ever made it through. California's farmers, pragmatic above all else, cared little for ideology. They saw efficient, disciplined labor and responded with grudging respect. They worked like clockwork. One Fresno foreman was quoted as saying in a local paper, "Don't talk much, don't complain, just pick." Still, curiosity crept in. Some farmers' wives left water or sandwiches near the fields. Children waved shyly from fence lines, and every time the guards barked warnings. No contact, no talking, no gifts. But in the quiet of the orchards, humanity was hard to contain. When the workday ended, the prisoners rode back to camp through the cooling dusk, the scent of citrus still clinging to their clothes. Inside the barracks, they shared brief conversations in low voices. Some compared the fruit to mandarins from Shizuoka. Others wondered how a nation that could grow such abundance could also unleash such destruction. Kondo said little. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling's wooden beams, listening to the distant creak of crickets. Somewhere outside, a freight train moaned through the valley, carrying crates marked Fresno, Tulare, Los Angeles. He thought of the oranges, thousands of them, leaving this land untouched by war. The thought was almost unbearable. The next morning, the guards announced a new directive from the War Department. Selected prisoners would begin working directly with civilian packing houses under observation. For the first time, they would step beyond the camp's wire and into the American world itself. The order came down in late July, typed on pale blue stationery from the Western Defense Command and stamped with the seal of the War Department. It authorized controlled exposure of Japanese prisoners to civilian industry for educational and psychological purposes. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was clear: to show captured soldiers the immensity of American capacity, not as a boast of victory, but as a lesson in democracy's reach. Under that quiet rationale, new programs took shape in California, Arizona, and Utah. They say were called rehabilitation projects, though the men who marched under the hot valley sun knew nothing of the word's nuance. Each group was screened, their records reviewed, their ranks dissolved. The ones chosen for outside work were not the defiant or the broken, but those who could be trusted to observe, to reflect, and perhaps one day to carry their impressions back to Japan. When Corporal Masao Kondo's name appeared on the list, he felt neither pride nor fear, only confusion. The guards loaded them onto open trucks at dawn, and by mid-morning they were deposited beside a sprawling packing facility outside Visalia. The air was thick with the hum of machinery and the smell of ripe fruit. Conveyor belts clattered, crates stamped sun-kissed and sun-gold moved in an endless loop, filling train cars bound for Chicago, New York, and beyond. To Kondo, it looked like an army in motion, but instead of rifles, the workers wielded paper, knives, and ink stamps. Rows of women in cotton dresses sorted oranges with astonishing speed, their laughter rising above the mechanical noise. They glanced at the POWs briefly, curiosity without hostility, before returning to their rhythm. From a raised catwalk, a War Department liaison, a man named Captain Lawrence Briggs, explained the purpose of what they were seeing. His voice carried through the translator. These men and women are civilians, not soldiers. They keep our nation fed. This is the strength of America, not in its guns, but in its farms, its workers, its freedom to produce. Kondo listened, the words filtering through layers of disbelief. Freedom, production. For months, he had believed America's power to be an abstraction, bombs falling from unseen skies, but here it was made visible. Abundance organized into motion, efficiency turned to sustenance. He looked down the line of oranges gliding past under the lights and thought, with a strange clarity, that he was seeing the opposite of war. That night, back in camp, the men spoke in hushed tones. Some dismissed it all as propaganda, a show for their benefit. Others, like Kondo, couldn't shake what they'd seen. If they can grow this much, one man murmured, they will never run out. They will never lose. Within weeks, reports from these field programs began circulating through Army channels. A memo from the Office of the Provost Marshal General noted that Japanese POWs display heightened curiosity toward American methods of food preservation, machinery, and agriculture. Another internal report, marked confidential, observed that exposure to industrial abundance often produced a reflective or softened outlook toward the enemy nation. It was a subtle form of warfare, persuasion through prosperity. Meanwhile, in Washington, debates continued. Some officials feared these programs blurred the moral lines of captivity. Others saw them as an investment in Japan's post-war future. If these men return home, understanding that freedom breeds efficiency, one colonel argued in a memorandum, they may sow the seeds of peace more effectively than any treaty. At Camp McCoy's California outpost, those seeds took on literal meaning. The prisoners began noticing how the orchards were grafted, old trunks fused with new shoots, producing sweeter fruit. It became an unspoken metaphor within the barracks. Kondo, ever the quiet observer, drew it in his small notebook. Two trees spliced together, their roots entwined beneath the soil. By late autumn, when the last harvest ended, the men had handled hundreds of thousands of oranges. The work left their hands rough and stained with the citrus oils that lingered long after washing. But the scent, that bright, clean aroma, became something they could not forget. And as the winter rains came to the valley, dripping softly on the barracks roofs, Kondo began to wonder if the world beyond war could ever be as simple as the act of tending something meant to grow. That question, fragile yet persistent, would soon find its test in the heat and hardship of daily labor. The descent begins among those endless rows of orange trees, where survival takes on a quieter, more human form. The mornings began before the sun crested the Sierra Nevada. A truck's engine would rumble to life, followed by the metallic clatter of boots on the flatbed. The guards checked each man by number, their flashlights slicing through the grey dawn. Within minutes, the column of prisoners, silhouettes hunched beneath wool caps and fatigue jackets, rolled out toward the fields. By late summer of 1945, the San Joaquin Valley had turned into a living furnace. Heat shimmered off the soil, and the scent of citrus oil thickened the air. The prisoners worked in near silence, their khaki shirts darkened by sweat. Kondo's hands, once trained for engineering precision, were now marked with small cuts and calluses. Yet there was a strange comfort in repetition, the snip of the clippers, the rustle of leaves, the muted thud of fruit hitting baskets. The guards kept their distance, rifles slung loosely over shoulders. Their orders were simple: prevent escape, maintain output. But in this landscape of abundance, the will to flee was almost unthinkable. Where would a Japanese soldier go in a valley lined with open sky and guarded by language, skin, and isolation? Instead, the men turned inward. Kondo's barrack bunkmate, a thin radio operator named Fujimoto, often whispered to him during lunch breaks. "Do you think this place is real?" he asked one day, biting into a piece of stale bread. "Maybe they built it to confuse us, to make us forget." Kondo didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on a farmer's truck parked beyond the fence. On the back, crates of oranges gleamed like sunlight trapped in wood. The farmer's wife, a young woman with her hair wrapped in a scarf, handed a bottle of water to one of the guards. For a fleeting second, her eyes met Kondo's through the wire. She didn't look away. That moment lingered in his mind for days. The next morning, when she passed again with the truck, she left something on the fence post. A single orange, its peel glistening with dew. The guards hadn't noticed. Kondo hesitated, heart pounding. Then, when no one was looking, he reached through the wire and took it. He held the fruit as if it were a relic. The skin was cool against his palms, the scent intoxicating. When he pressed his thumb into the peel, a fine mist of oil burst into the air, filling his lungs with sweetness. He tore off a small segment and bit down. The taste was sharp, alive, almost shocking after months of bland rations. It was the first true flavor he had known since his capture, and in that moment, for reasons he could not explain, he felt both gratitude and shame. That night, lying in the barracks, he stared at the ceiling again. He thought about the woman, about the fruit, about the invisible boundaries that divided kindness from duty. War had taught him that enemies were faceless, monstrous. Yet the taste of the orange refused that logic. It was human. The next day, he noticed more gestures. A guard flicked his cigarette lighter toward a prisoner struggling with a broken tool, wordless permission to use it. A farmer's son left a tin cup of water by the shade of a fence post. These were not acts of rebellion, nor sympathy. Exactly, just small, unspoken recognitions of shared exhaustion under the same unrelenting sun. Each evening, the men returned with baskets stacked high. They began to understand the rhythm of the land, the way irrigation water moved through the canals, how shade shifted over the rows. Their labor had become something more than survival. It was a kind of silent participation in rebuilding a world they had once tried to destroy. In his notebook, Kondo wrote a line in Japanese: "We do not own this soil, yet it teaches us." And as the days lengthened into the season's last harvest, that lesson deepened with every fruit they touched. By September, The scent of ripening fruit was heavy enough to seem unreal, like living inside a perfume of earth and sunlight. The heat still shimmered each afternoon, but now the air began to carry a hint of autumn, the slow, cooling breath of harvest's end. Kondo had become foreman of his work detail, a quiet leader chosen more for his steadiness than his rank. He moved among the rows, checking baskets, making sure no fruit was wasted. The guards trusted him, not openly, but in the small ways that mattered. Sometimes they spoke to him in clipped English. Other times, they simply nodded, an unspoken contract between worker and warden. One morning, as the men loaded crates for the rail yard, Kondo noticed something astonishing. A line of refrigerated rail cars waiting under the canopy of eucalyptus trees. Painted silver and white, marked Santa Fe, Produce Express, each car exhaled a faint cool mist when opened. The guards joked about keeping the fruit fresh all the way to Chicago, but to the prisoners, the sight was something close to magic. Kondo approached the nearest car cautiously, the metallic chill brushing his face. Inside, air poured from vents, cold air flowing from unseen machines. The other prisoners peered in, murmuring. Fujimoto whispered, "Even their fruit travels in comfort." It wasn't mockery, it was awe. The Americans had built a world where oranges rode across a continent in ice, where food was preserved by power invisible to the human hand. For men who had fought in jungles where malaria and starvation ruled, this revelation struck deep. That night, back in camp, Kondo lay awake listening to the rhythmic hum of the distant refrigeration units. He thought about Japan's soldiers dying in caves without water, about the field hospitals where a single tin of condensed milk could mean survival. The contrast was unbearable. In the darkness, he murmured to Fujimoto, "We fought to defend honor, but they fight to preserve life itself." Fujimoto didn't respond. He was staring at the ceiling, eyes wide open. "Maybe," he said finally, "that's why they'll win." Days later, as the war officially ended, the orchard labor continued under a strange new silence. Guards received newspapers with the headlines, "Japan surrenders," but few prisoners could bring themselves to ask for details. Kondo felt both relief and humiliation, as if the surrender had already happened within him weeks earlier, there among the endless orange trees. The farmer's wife returned once more. She stood by the fence, her face unreadable. Without a word, she held out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, 2 oranges, perfectly round. The guard nearby saw her and said nothing. Kondo accepted the gift, bowing slightly, unsure if it was allowed. The woman gave a faint nod, then turned and walked back to the truck. He shared one of the oranges with Fujimoto that evening. They peeled it slowly, reverently, as if opening a letter from home. The juice ran over their fingers, bright under the dim barrack light. No words were spoken. None were needed. For Kondo, that final taste of California's fruit was not victory or defeat. It was revelation. A reminder that strength could be gentle and abundance could be disciplined. America's power, he realized, was not only in its weapons or its machines, it was in its capacity to feed millions, to make even its prisoners labor for something alive, something that grew under the open sun. Weeks later, when he was repatriated and boarded the ship home, he carried with him a single dried orange peel, tucked inside his notebook. On the voyage across the Pacific, he would sometimes lift it to his face and breathe in its fading scent, a fragment of that strange, bright valley. Years afterward, when his children asked what America was like, he would say softly, "It smelled like oranges." The sun climbed slowly, drenching the barracks in warmth that was both comforting and relentless. Inside, the prisoners moved with quiet familiarity, performing tasks that had become ritual. They swept the floors, repaired torn clothing, and arranged their meager personal items along the narrow bunks. There was no hurry, yet no pause, as if the rhythm of the camp dictated the passage of time more than the hours themselves. Kondo rose early as always. His body remembered the orchard labor even when he was no longer in the fields. The rough calluses on his hands itched when idle. He spent mornings cleaning tools, sharpening clippers, and occasionally helping a younger prisoner adjust the metal hooks used for hauling fruit crates. Conversation was minimal, a few murmured words in Japanese, punctuated by the distant shouts of guards preparing for their day in the orchard. Meals arrived with mechanical precision. Trays of rice, beans, and small portions of meat slid along tables, accompanied by the constant hum of the camp's ventilation. The taste was monotonous, yet sustenance had become a ritual, a quiet meditation. Kondo sometimes watched the other men as they ate, noticing how subtle gestures, the careful arrangement of a spoon, the shared glance over a half-eaten portion, spoke volumes about their unspoken bonds. At midday, the prisoners were allowed a short walk along the orchard's edge. Even here, the routine imposed itself. Guards trailed at a distance, hands resting on rifle butts. Kondo observed the workers on the American side, women sorting fruit, children peering over fences, farmhands moving swiftly between sheds. There was a strange ordinariness to it, a life continuing in the presence of captives. The prisoners, despite restrictions, found ways to carve moments of humanity from the day. One man, Tanaka, would hum old army songs softly, almost to himself, while repairing baskets. Another, Sato, meticulously polished the insignia on his jacket, a quiet effort to maintain dignity. Kondo often joined them, not to lead or instruct, but to share in the tactile reassurance of work done well. Evenings brought a subtle change. The sun dropped low, painting the orchards in streaks of orange light that reflected off the shiny fruit. Guards returned to their posts in the shade of eucalyptus trees, and the prisoners performed their last duties, storing tools, sweeping paths, and securing the rows of crates awaiting transport. The air carried the sweet, lingering scent of citrus, a constant reminder of abundance and life beyond the wire. Small, secret gestures emerged in the rhythm of these days. A water bottle left by a farmer's child, a neatly tied bundle of oranges tucked beside a fence post. These acts, minor in appearance, carried enormous significance. Kondo sometimes paused to breathe in the scent of the oranges, tracing the oil on his fingers, letting the memory of the first taste guide him through the exhaustion and monotony. Night fell, and the barracks settled into quiet. The hum of insects mingled with distant machinery from the orchards. Letters censored by American authorities were read aloud in whispers, fragments of home life and worry carried across thousands of miles. Kondo carefully folded his portion, memorizing phrases, tracing characters with the tip of his finger. In these evenings, the prisoners were neither captives nor free. They were observers, laborers, and humans struggling to maintain a fragile interior order. Every day passed in the same quiet rhythm, yet within each repetition was a subtle evolution: respect for labor, curiosity about the world beyond the fence, and the growing significance of small kindnesses. As the moon rose over the orchards, Kondo noted in his notebook, "Even here, in repetition, life finds its form. Even here, we learn to see." The stage was set for transformation, the moment when the ordinary labor of the orchard would collide with the extraordinary news of surrender. By late September, the daily routines had settled into a quiet predictability. The orchards seemed almost alive in their repetition. The same rows, the same colors, the same hum of distant machinery. Prisoners rose at dawn, worked under the sun, ate their modest meals, and returned to the barracks, yet each day carried subtle differences: a fruit slightly sweeter, a breeze carrying a new scent, a guard who offered a nod rather than a command. Kondo found comfort in these small consistencies. He learned the paths of the irrigation channels, the angles at which the sunlight hit the leaves, the way certain trees bore fruit faster than others. Each morning he would walk past the same grove where the first orange had been placed for him, tracing the memory of that moment as he clipped, stacked, and carried. The fruit became a quiet teacher. Lessons in patience, in observation, in the careful stewardship of life. The prisoners discovered ways to make the work bearable. They would hum softly while moving crates, invent silent signals to coordinate lifting, and occasionally exchange scraps of conversation about far-off families and homes. Humor emerged, too, in whispered jokes about the awkwardness of Americans' precise instructions or the absurdity of measuring oranges with military-like precision. These small acts of resistance and camaraderie strengthened bonds that had formed under the pressure of labor and captivity. At night, the barracks became a place of reflection. Some men wrote letters they knew would never leave, drawing sketches of the orchards and the distant mountains. Others tended small gardens of weeds or herbs in pots placed near the windows. Kondo, as always, documented everything in his notebook: the scent of oranges, the tension in the air when a guard approached too closely, the brief kindnesses from farmers' families. Every detail mattered. It was a way to assert control over a life otherwise constrained by fences and schedules. The guards, for their part, began to show subtle signs of familiarity. Some offered advice on how to carry heavier crates without strain. Others left small notes of encouragement or extra water by the fence. No one spoke openly of friendship, but gestures built an unspoken trust. Kondo realized that survival here depended not only on physical endurance, but on reading these nuances, on understanding the humanity of those who had once been enemies. The orchard itself became a stage for quiet experiments in morality and understanding. Kondo and his comrades observed how life continued despite the boundaries imposed by war. Bees moved from blossom to blossom, rainwater filled the irrigation channels in perfect rhythm, and the oranges continued to ripen regardless of human conflict. In this natural order, they found a mirror for their own desires: to nurture, to sustain, and ultimately to survive without causing destruction. Weeks passed, each day layering onto the last, creating a tapestry of labor, observation, and subtle reflection. The prisoners began to anticipate patterns. When the sun would strike a grove just right, when a crate would slip and roll back into the row, when a guard's attention would lapse. These patterns offered a sense of agency, a fragile feeling of mastery over circumstance, and an awareness that even in captivity, life could teach lessons that extended far beyond the orchard. Then came the news. Japan had surrendered. The words filtered into the camp with the same quiet insistence as the sun, carrying shock, disbelief, and a strange relief. The routine would never be the same. The labor remained, but now each movement, each step among the trees, was tinged with the knowledge that the war had ended, that the men were soon to be free, and that the world they had known and been forced to fight against was changing irrevocably. The ordinary rhythms of the orchard had prepared them for something extraordinary. The reckoning of their lives, the collision of guilt, gratitude, and hope that would define the turning point of their captivity. The announcement of Japan's surrender arrived like an unexpected gust through the orchards. Guards read the newspapers aloud, their voices cutting through the midday heat, though most prisoners could barely follow the English. Kondo and his comrades exchanged uncertain glances. Relief warred with disbelief. Exhaustion warred with the slow dawning of a new reality. The war that had dictated every thought, every movement, every sacrifice was over. Yet the orchard, the sun, the smell of citrus remained. The work continued, but everything felt altered. Crates of fruit slid along conveyors with a mechanical indifference, while Kondo's hands trembled as he lifted another basket. The oranges, so vivid against the green leaves, now seemed symbolic, not merely sustenance, but tokens of survival, of life preserved despite chaos. He caught himself lingering over one particularly plump fruit, remembering the first orange the farmer's wife had left at the fence. Its memory now bore more weight than any ration or report. The surrender stirred an inner reckoning. Prisoners reflected on the paradox of their circumstances. Captured and defeated, yet laboring in abundance, protected by a nation they had been trained to despise. Many wrote in their journals, careful to document their impressions under the scrutiny of American censors. Kondo's notebook became a mosaic of small observations, the way sunlight pierced the leaves, the sound of bees in bloom, the soft laughter of children who came to watch the laborers. In these moments, the prisoners glimpsed a humanity that war had denied them. Even the guards seemed to shift. Their commands softened, their posture eased. Some offered explanations for procedures rather than terse orders. One young corporal, noticing Kondo's fatigue, handed him a water bottle and nodded silently. These gestures, seemingly minor, carried a significance the prisoners had not known how to measure. Every smile, every pause in vigilance became a subtle bridge across the gulf of enmity. Kondo felt the symbolic weight of the orange more keenly than ever. One afternoon, he removed a segment from a fruit he had set aside, peeling it slowly and holding it in his palm. The sweet scent rose, sharp and bright. He walked to the fence where the young farmer's boy often lingered, and hesitated, thinking of the divide, the wire, the language, the war. Then he pressed the slice into the child's small hand, letting it rest there like an offering. The boy's eyes widened, and for a moment the orchard became a place of shared humanity, not captivity. That evening, whispers spread through the barracks. Some prisoners laughed quietly, marveling at the audacity of small acts. Others remained silent, lost in thought, considering how fragile and fleeting such gestures could be in the shadow of war. Kondo scribbled in his notebook, "One fruit, one gesture. It is not power, but it teaches more than orders ever could." The surrender created a strange temporal dissonance. They were still prisoners, still bound by rules, yet the war's end infused the air with uncertainty and possibility. The orchard's ordinary labor became a crucible for reflection, forcing men to confront questions of guilt, gratitude, and the faintest hint of hope. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the rows of citrus, Kondo understood that his life, once defined by military precision and obedience, would now be shaped by choices measured not in rank, but in care, in attention, and in the quiet courage of small gestures. The days following the surrender carried a strange tension. Work continued, but it was no longer merely about harvesting fruit. Each crate, each bushel of oranges, became a meditation on time, responsibility, and the fragile human connections that had emerged among the prisoners and the Americans who oversaw them. Kondo walked the orchards with a quiet vigilance, noting the subtle interactions between men and guards, between laborers and the environment itself. Every gesture, every glance became a part of the unspoken curriculum of reflection. One morning, the farmer's wife returned, carrying 2 baskets of fruit. She placed them carefully at the fence, stepping back as the guards observed. Kondo hesitated, then approached and nodded slightly. The action was not one of surrender or gratitude, but of acknowledgement. He could see in her eyes a recognition of shared labor, a fragile understanding that even enemies could participate in life's continuity. He carefully distributed the fruit among the prisoners, offering small segments to those who had worked beside him through the long, sun-drenched days. Each bite was eaten with reverent silence, the sweetness a reminder that life persisted despite destruction. The motif of the orange, once merely a symbol of curiosity or fleeting joy, now assumed deeper significance. It represented trust, resilience, and the human capacity for empathy even amidst the residues of war. Kondo began experimenting with small acts of care beyond the orchards. He tended to a fellow prisoner's minor injury, adjusted a fallen fence post, and even instructed a younger laborer on the proper way to select fruit for packing. These gestures, though small, carried moral weight. They were conscious acts of responsibility in a world recently defined by chaos. That week, an army memo circulated, noting the behavioral shift among Japanese POWs engaged in civilian labor. Observers remarked that prisoners demonstrated increased cooperation, attentiveness, and subtle empathy toward both guards and farmers. Kondo's own conduct reflected this trend. He realized that labor, observation, and exposure to abundance were teaching lessons far beyond manual skills. They were teaching comprehension, the understanding that power need not be violent, that efficiency could serve life, and that ordinary gestures could carry extraordinary meaning. Evenings became a time for reflection and quiet ritual. The men would sit outside the barracks, peeling and sharing oranges while tracing patterns of the orchard in the dirt. They discussed the differences between Japanese and American approaches to labor and life, comparing scarcity with abundance, discipline with freedom. Kondo often remained silent, absorbing, allowing the world around him, the trees, the sun, the gentle movements of guards and farmers, to imprint lessons onto his consciousness. The final act of the turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Kondo planted a small seed from an orange near the fence line, pressing it into the soil with careful fingers. The guards watched but did not interfere, and the farmers passed by, oblivious. For Kondo, the seed was more than a gesture. It was a tangible symbol of hope, of continuity, and of his own emerging philosophy of life. He imagined it growing over the years, rooted in soil, tilled by lands that once knew war, watered by a sun that now promised renewal. By the end of the week, the prisoner's work was no longer defined solely by labor or obedience. It had become a conduit for transformation, moral, emotional, and spiritual. The orange, once a simple fruit, now carried the weight of revelation, that humanity could be nurtured even in captivity, that acts of kindness could transcend borders and ideology, and that the lessons learned in the ordinary rhythms of life might survive far beyond the orchards of California. From the quiet tension of surrender, the scene was set for liberation, the collapse of captivity, and the journey toward home, both literal and metaphorical. By late October 1945, the air carried a new tension. The prisoners had long known their status as captives, yet now, with the surrender confirmed and the war's conclusion official, the boundaries of control seemed both rigid and fragile. Trucks carried men to the orchards and back. Guards still posted along the fences, but a quiet unease had settled in, a sense that the old order was dissolving. Even the oranges seemed brighter under the sun, as if the trees themselves had sensed change. Kondo rose early, his body attuned to the rhythm of the orchards. Today, however, the task felt different. Each basket lifted carried the weight of not just fruit, but of impending freedom. The men moved deliberately, yet with a subtle lightness, their steps freer than before, their glances flicking toward the fences with a mixture of curiosity and relief. The guards, too, walked with a lighter hand, their rifles slung more casually. There was no need for announcements. Everyone could sense that something was ending. Word had circulated that repatriation would begin soon. The first transports were being scheduled, their timing coordinated by Army logistics and international agreements. For Kondo, this news brought a tangle of emotions: relief, fear, and an unexpected sorrow. The orchards, the work, the quiet gestures of kindness, they had become a strange sanctuary. Leaving it felt like abandoning a small, sacred world. The day's labor carried a sense of finality. Kondo paused at the fence, observing the farmer's boy who had often lingered there. Today, the boy offered a small tin cup of water and, without speaking, a piece of bread. Kondo accepted it, the gesture heavier than any report or ration. Later, he would take a single orange from his own basket and, with careful hands, slice it for the boy. The sweet, fragrant segments were an unspoken farewell, a tangible link between two worlds that had been brought together by circumstance. As the sun climbed, the trucks arrived to transport prisoners to the staging area. Kondo and his comrades climbed aboard, the hum of engines filling the air as the orchards receded behind them. Every man carried a memory of labor, of small kindnesses, of oranges pressed into their hands or gifted to others. Each memory was a bridge between captivity and freedom, a record of lessons learned that could not be erased by war's end. At the staging camp, formalities awaited. Men were counted, inspected, and given instructions for boarding ships bound for repatriation. Guards processed paperwork with mechanical efficiency, but their demeanor had softened. For many, the recognition of shared labor and mutual respect had left a quiet mark, a subtle acknowledgement of humanity beyond the fences. Kondo lingered for a moment, touching the small orange seed he had planted near the orchard fence weeks before. It remained in the soil, small and unassuming, yet charged with symbolic weight. In its growth, he saw a reflection of his own journey, rooted in hardship, nourished by care, and destined to survive beyond the confines of captivity. The first group of ships departed in the afternoon. The prisoners watched the coastline fade behind them, the orchards a vivid memory etched in sunlight and fragrance. The hum of engines, the creak of the ship, and the distant call of gulls replaced the mechanical rhythm of the orchards, yet the lessons of labor and abundance traveled with them across the Pacific. Kondo, pressed the dried peel of the first orange he had tasted into his notebook. Its scent, faint but persistent, reminded him of the days in the sun, the small acts of kindness, and the fragile, luminous hope that had grown alongside him. Each prisoner carried such relics, mental or tangible, bridging the distance between what had been endured and what lay ahead. The ship's wake cut through the water, carrying them toward home, toward an uncertain future, toward the conclusion of captivity. But the orchard, the oranges, and the quiet lessons of labor remained, ready to bloom again, if only in memory. The voyage across the Pacific was slow, punctuated by the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull and the faint hum of the ship's engines. Prisoners moved cautiously along the decks, observing one another, adjusting to a freedom they had not yet fully earned. Kondo stood near the railing, holding the small notebook that contained the dried orange peel. Its faint scent reminded him of the orchards, the sun, and the quiet acts of care that had sustained him. Days passed in repetition, but unlike the monotonous rhythms of the orchards, this voyage carried anticipation. Conversations began to emerge among prisoners, low murmurs about home, about what they might encounter upon return, about how the world had changed in their absence. For Kondo, these conversations were a test of perspective. Could he reconcile duty with reflection, honor with the unexpected compassion he had witnessed? Repatriation arrived with subtle ceremony. Dock workers assisted the prisoners down gangways, their hands firm but not unkind. Guards, who had once maintained distance and authority, now offered instructions with gentleness, guiding men toward transport vehicles that would carry them further inland. Kondo noted the absence of tension. The formalities had shifted into a ritual of transition rather than enforcement. Once on land, the POWs were processed through temporary holding facilities. Kondo observed the mechanics of reintegration, medical checks, registration, and the sorting of personal belongings. He felt the weight of each step. Each small bureaucratic gesture underscored the difference between captivity and the freedom that was slowly returning. Yet even here, the lessons of the orchards persisted. The patience, the attention to detail, the ability to notice subtle signs of humanity, these traits guided him through the unfamiliar procedures. One evening, in a temporary barracks, Kondo and Fujimoto reflected on the journey. They peeled a small orange brought by a sympathetic guard, sharing segments with quiet reverence. The fruit was sweet, its aroma familiar and grounding. Kondo remarked on how even the smallest acts, a slice of orange, a nod of recognition, had shaped their understanding of human resilience and moral choice. Fujimoto nodded, noting that abundance could teach lessons that no lecture or manual ever could. When finally transported to the port of embarkation for Japan, Kondo looked back at the land that had held him captive and taught him so much. The orchards, the packing houses, and the small gestures of farmers and guards alike were no longer confined to memory. They had become a part of him, a moral compass to guide his return. The journey home carried them through familiar waters, now rendered strange by the passage of time. Kondo clutched his notebook, turning the pages to the sketches of orange trees and fields, to the written reflections on labor and abundance. Each entry was a relic, a testament to endurance and to the unexpected generosity of those who had once been strangers. Upon arrival in Japan, the prisoners were greeted with a mix of relief, sorrow, and uncertainty. Families waited at ports, faces etched with the strains of war. Kondo stepped onto the dock, carrying not just the weight of months spent in labor, but the enduring lessons of compassion, diligence, and observation. He realized that the final liberation was not only physical, the collapse of captivity, but moral and emotional. The orchard, with its abundance and rhythm, had prepared him for life beyond confinement. As he walked toward home, the memory of the first orange returned vividly, its scent, its color, and the first taste that had broken the monotony of war. That single fruit had become emblematic of survival, of subtle courage, and of the human capacity to recognize kindness in unexpected places. The stage was now set for reflection and the return to civilian life, where the lessons learned in labor, observation, and quiet human connection would echo long after the fences had disappeared. The streets of Tokyo were quieter than Kondo remembered. Buildings bore the scars of bombings. Rubble lined narrow alleys, and yet the city pulsed with resilience. Returning POWs like Kondo walked among crowds that had survived fire, hunger, and fear, carrying within themselves lessons from a foreign land where life had continued under improbable conditions. The memory of California's orchards lingered with almost painful clarity. The sun, the scent of oranges, the rhythmic hum of labor, and the quiet gestures of kindness that had pierced the monotony of captivity. Kondo moved through the city with a strange awareness. Ordinary sounds, the chatter of children, the clatter of streetcars, the metallic rattle of market carts, carried echoes of life in the orchards. He noticed small patterns, a vendor arranging fruit carefully in baskets, a child reaching for a peeled segment offered by a parent, the meticulous work of women folding cloth in open-air shops. It was as if the abundance he had witnessed abroad had imprinted itself on his perception, shaping how he saw the world around him now. Letters and photographs collected from the camp journey became treasures. Kondo often turned the pages of his notebook, revisiting sketches of orange trees, the crates stacked along conveyor belts, and the careful renderings of irrigation canals. Each line of ink was a testament to endurance, but also a subtle meditation on what had been learned about human behavior, trust, and the quiet power of generosity. Reintegration was neither swift nor easy. Many former POWs faced suspicion or indifference from their fellow citizens. Yet Kondo's perspective, sharpened by exposure to abundance and disciplined labor in the orchards, offered a unique lens through which to interpret the devastation at home. He saw possibility where others saw ruin, land that could be replanted, communities that could rebuild, and people who could nurture life rather than destroy it. He began to share his experiences with small groups, recounting the subtle lessons learned in captivity. He spoke not of military strategy or enemy weakness, but of labor, of observation, of human gestures that transcended the strict divisions of wartime morality. Listeners, young men who had survived the conflict, and elders weary of loss, found themselves captivated by these narratives of quiet resilience. The orange, once a simple fruit, had become a symbol of endurance, reflection, and the human capacity to find meaning in the ordinary. Kondo also reflected on the guards and farmers he had encountered. Their gestures, water bottles left at the fence, nods of recognition, small gifts of fruit, had become a moral compass in a world that had been defined by orders and obedience. He realized that these acts were not extraordinary in their context, but extraordinary in their consequences, shaping the consciousness of men who had once been indoctrinated for war. In the evenings, he revisited the city's outskirts, where citrus orchards still survived among rubble and reconstruction. He would walk slowly, inhaling the faint fragrance of oranges, noting how trees bent toward the sun, how soil retained moisture from recent rains, and how life, stubborn and persistent, pushed upward, even amidst devastation. In these moments, the past and present merged, and Kondo felt the continuum of labor, observation, and transformation. The motif of the orange persisted. Kondo pressed dried peels between the pages of his notebook, carried segments of fruit to share with neighbors, and recalled the first taste from the hands of a stranger in California. Each memory served as a reminder that even in captivity, lessons about human kindness, labor, and endurance could take root. The horizon of Tokyo glowed faintly as the sun set. The city, like Kondo himself, had survived trauma and hardship. Both bore scars, both held memories, and both faced the challenge of nurturing new life in the aftermath of destruction. The lessons from California's orchards: patience, observation, quiet generosity, would continue to guide him as he navigated the complex landscape of post-war Japan. Winter settled slowly over Tokyo, turning the city's edges gray and muted. Yet the orchards and gardens that remained carried subtle reminders of life's persistence. Kondo walked along a narrow street, lined with citrus trees, still heavy with fruit, recalling the endless rows of California orchards, the sun-drenched leaves, the scent of oranges pressed into palms, the rhythm of labor that had quietly reshaped his understanding of survival. He traced the patterns of sunlight on the ground, noting how shadows stretched differently in this city, yet still mirrored the meticulous lines of orchards he had left behind. At home, life had resumed its ordinary rhythms, yet nothing felt entirely ordinary. Meals were simple, yet each bite of fruit or portion of rice seemed layered with memory. Kondo found himself recalling moments of subtle kindness from months past: the young farmer's boy offering water, a guard's silent nod, a parcel of oranges left on a fence post. Each memory became a touchstone for moral reflection, a quiet reassurance that humanity could survive even under the strictest confines of war. He began corresponding with former comrades, sharing lessons gleaned from California, not the military precision of work, but the human dynamics of labor and care. They wrote of the same orange trees, the same repetitive tasks, the same fleeting moments of grace that had imprinted on their consciousness. The letters were more than nostalgia. They were a testament to the endurance of observation and moral awakening. Kondo also observed children in the streets, watching how they reached for oranges at market stalls, laughed with abandon, and played with a freedom unbroken by the war. He realized that the gestures he had witnessed as a prisoner, simple acts of giving, of acknowledging another's presence, had a generational echo. The orange, once a gift across fences, now became a symbol for life's continuity and the subtle power of human connection. Occasionally, he would return to the outskirts of the city, where small orchards were being replanted amid reconstruction. Kneeling in the soil, he pressed a seed into the earth, remembering the tiny orange seed he had planted in California weeks before his repatriation. He watered it carefully, letting the memory of the orchard guide each motion. In that moment, labor, patience, and hope intertwined, a quiet counterpoint to the chaos he had endured. Even in casual conversation, Kondo noticed his perspective had shifted. He spoke of abundance and care rather than conflict and strategy. He recounted the smell of oranges in the California sun, the tactile sensation of peeling fruit, the shared quiet between men and Americans who had once been strangers. These memories became moral anchors, subtle tools for navigating a world still recovering from devastation. As spring approached, the citrus trees around his home bloomed, filling the air with fragrance. Kondo paused often, inhaling deeply, and felt the echo of past lessons in the rhythm of petals falling and fruit swelling. Life persisted, and he carried a quiet understanding. Survival alone was insufficient. One must observe, learn, and respond with care. Human resilience, he now knew, was nourished not only by sustenance, but by attention, patience, and the acknowledgement of others. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the city, and Kondo reflected on the journey from captivity to return. He had been bound by fences, monitored by guards, yet the experiences of labor, abundance, and subtle kindness had reshaped his perception of both enemies and self. The orange, simple and unassuming, had become a symbol of all that endured, a reminder that even in the shadow of war, life and humanity could be nurtured. If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again.